Of the various points I made in my recent commentary on ContraPoints, easily the one that ended up being the most controversial was my statement that I did not believe the issue of Gaza is what led to Harris's defeat in 2024. Mind you, I understand why this logic would be popular among Zionist Democrats. However, what really caught me off guard is I've seen anti-Zionists repeat this line of reasoning. One person told me that they just don't think people like me want to grapple with the reality that it is a good thing that Democrats faced consequences for supporting genocide. But the issue at hand is not that Democrats faced consequences, it's that a Republican got into the White House. Specifically one who his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, directly said would create the most pro-Israel administration in American history. Who has attempted to deport activists that take part in protests against the state of Israel, and who wants to restrict research money for universities that have criticized Israel. If that's really the end result of the anti-Zionist or pro-Palestine movement, then it's been a miserable failure. By the way, if you're under the impression this will make Democrats more open to being against Israel, then you just have no understanding of recent history. The article I mentioned in the video, which discussed similar ideas to what I talked about, directly compared the idea of Harris losing the 2024 election because of her stance on Israel to the notion that Ralph Nader's third-party candidacy in 2000 is what cost Al Gore the election and gave the presidency to George W. Bush. Now, the current hostility the Democratic Party has towards progressivism is for a couple of reasons, among them George McGovern's loss in 1972, Michael Dukakis' loss in 1988, and Bill Clinton winning on triangulation in 1992. However, there's also just a stigma against progressives in general as incredibly untrustworthy and willing to give up their own best interests just to spite the DNC. And that is definitely the result of 2000. This is a topic I expanded upon in a recent article called How Nader Actually Ruined the Progressive Cause, and the entire DNC for that matter, which will be linked in my sources. In the aftermath of the 2000 election, there was nobody more hated in the DNC than Nader voters, especially people who voted for Nader in states Al Gore lost. They were stereotyped as completely unreasonable human beings who essentially allowed somebody they disagreed with more than Al Gore to be in the White House because they'd rather support a candidate they knew couldn't win, but was only slightly closer to them ideologically. I'm not saying I agree or disagree with that notion for the record, I'm just saying it's what happened. Michael Moore, in his 2002 book Stupid White Men, even gave an example of a letter he got from someone who blamed him and his fellow Nader voters for Bush being in the White House. Dear Jerk, it read, I hope you are satisfied with what you have done. You and that egomaniac Ralph Nader will have us all drinking arsenic in our water before we know it. Do us a favor, drop dead. And you could see traces of this within the DNC for years to come. See Robert Gibbs' infamous comments about left-wing critics of Obama needing to be drug tested, and how they will be satisfied when we have Canadian healthcare and we've eliminated the Pentagon. Two things that are equally as reasonable, I guess. That's not reality. They wouldn't be satisfied if Dennis Kucinich was president. Or even the fact that certain people in the DNC blamed Bernie Sanders and his supporters for Hillary Clinton's loss in 2016. And now I'm seeing anti-Zionists basically say they're incredibly happy the same thing allegedly happened. As if that's not just going to make the DNC more hostile to their cause. Something that we're already seeing, by the way. Anybody remember those TikToks that went viral after 2024 of people saying they wouldn't care about the issue of Gaza going forward because Arab Americans didn't vote for Harris? Hell, to this day, you can still find Harris supporters mocking Muslims that voted for Trump specifically in Dearborn, Michigan. even though Harris winning Michigan would only give her 241 electoral votes to Donald Trump's 297. It is at this point I think it's a reasonable question to ask, who exactly was this good for? It wasn't good for those in Gaza, it wasn't good for Muslim Americans, and it wasn't good for critics of Zionism. The only people who seemed to benefit from these actions playing out as they did are Islamophobes, Zionists, and Republicans. Mind you, what I've described so far is based on the notion that this is what ended up happening, something that, as I've made clear, I am not entirely convinced of. However, I think it outlines very well why you should be incredibly careful before accepting such a narrative, especially if you yourself are not a Zionist. However, facts are facts, and fundamentally, that should be the deciding principle on if this notion is believed. So, as for why I don't, I present you all the rest of this commentary. Mind you, I haven't even discussed the person I'll be commentating on today. You see, this person also recommended me an article by Ryan Grimm, with the headline, Kamala Harris paid the price for not breaking with Biden on Gaza, new poll shows. Now, Ryan's been promoting this idea basically since Harris lost the 2024 election, even running a segment later that month on Breaking Point about this topic, which he also put in text over on his Substack. And by the way, before I get into the article I actually want to cover, I should note that Ryan does make some factual errors in these pieces of content, such as right here.
At a press conference in the summer of 1965, one reporter told President Lyndon Johnson, the day after a bombing of North Vietnam, quote, "Mr. President, from what you have outlined as your program for now, it would seem that you feel that we can have guns and butter for the foreseeable future. Do you have any idea right now, though, that down the road, a piece of the American people may have to face the problem of guns or butter?" LBJ said that the American people would be willing to bear the burden. He said, quote, "I have not the slightest doubt, but whatever it is necessary to face, the American people will face," he responded. Now, he was wrong, of course, and the runaway inflation produced by the war spending broke the back of the New Deal coalition, shattering organized labor and ushering in neoliberalism and the Reagan Revolution.
Never mind how there were 3 presidents between Johnson leaving office and Reagan entering it, all of whom dealt with greater rates of inflation than Lyndon Johnson did. Also, inflation under Johnson was not just caused by the war in Vietnam, it was that, along with the war on poverty, put together with the fact that one of Johnson's first actions upon taking office was signing a massive tax cut Kennedy had proposed. One that he refused to reverse, primarily because he feared he wouldn't have the political capital to do such. Tax increases famously being something that take a lot of political capital to do. For those unaware, essentially the first 2 things experts will tell you to do during times of inflation are raise taxes and raise interest rates. And LBJ did not want to do either of those if he could avoid it. Fuck, Johnson famously threw his Federal Reserve chairman against a wall because he raised interest rates at one point during his administration.
Democrats, as they hunt for the culprit that cost them the election, are getting some of it right. Dramatically expanding the social safety net at the beginning of Biden's term, letting people know that a better world actually is possible, and then letting it all lapse as prices stayed high, turned out to be a political handicap. Then, instead of attacking the price hikes as the rotten fruit of greedy CEOs with too much economic and political power, the White House shot down the entire notion of greedflation, which has since confirmed as a driving factor in those price increases. And instead, they outsourced the fight against inflation to a Republican Fed chair who jacked up rates and with it the cost of mortgages and rent.
Okay, first off, can I see some evidence that greedflation was responsible for the inflation under the Biden administration? I'm not even saying that's inherently incorrect. I would just like to see some proof. Also, obviously the Fed is going to raise interest rates in response to high amounts of inflation, regardless of whose fault it is. because that's just what you're supposed to do from an economic standpoint. That was what Paul Volcker did back when he was chairman of the Federal Reserve in the 1970s and 80s, which got the inflation rate under control essentially through creating a recession, which meant that money wasn't circulating, and with that, well, the currency wasn't inflating.
Democrats are also blaming wokeness, whether it's trans girls playing girls' sports, or the word Latinx, or generally the rise of a more dogmatic approach to identity politics that became popular on the left over the past decade. Now, I don't think they're actually wrong to examine that dogmatism. And I wrote a widely read piece in 2022 on how the phenomenon was destroying progressive institutions while a culture of fear and silence reigned.
Yeah, and that article was also a bunch of nonsense. It essentially argued the reason why progressive organizations were not doing as well as they could be was because they were spending too much time on internal efforts to combat discrimination against marginalized groups. Here's him explaining that, but fair warning, because of the length of the quote, it's going to take me a little bit longer to get through than it normally would. For progressive movement organizations, 2021 promised to be the year they turned power into policy, with a Democratic trifecta and the Biden administration broadcasting a bold vision of transformational change. Out of the gate, Democrats pushed ahead with the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, funding everything from expanded health care to a new monthly child tax credit. Republican efforts to slow walk the process with disingenuous counteroffers were simply dismissed. And then, sometime in the summer, the forward momentum stalled, and many of the progressive gains lapsed or were reversed. Instead of fueling a groundswell of public support to reinvigorate the party's ambitious agenda, most of the foundation-backed organizations that make up the backbone of the party's ideological infrastructure were still spending their time locked in virtual retreats, Slack wars, and the healing secessions, grappling with tensions over hierarchy, patriarchy, race, gender, and power. So much energy has been devoted to the internal strife and internal bullshit that it's had a real impact on the ability for groups to deliver, said one organizational leader who departed his position. It's been huge, particularly over the last year and a half or so, the ability for groups to focus on their mission, whether it's reproductive justice or jobs or fighting climate change. Okay, a couple of things. First off, you actually completely ignore the real reason why progress was undone in these 3 paragraphs, that being politicians not supporting progressive causes. Which politicians that voted against these measures would have changed their minds on the condition activist groups were a bit better at organizing? Can you name them for me? Because otherwise, you're doing little more than allowing the people with actual power off the hook while blaming those trying to create a better world who just don't have the same means to do such as the aforementioned people in power. Also, the point about Democrats having a trifecta is incredibly misleading. Democrats and Republicans had 50 Senate seats each after the results of 2020's Senate elections. The only reason why Democrats were considered having a majority is because they also had the presidency and the vice presidency, with the vice president being the president of the Senate. For reference regarding just how fragile such a majority is, the last time that happened in the Senate was in 2001. It was the same setup, 50 Republican senators, 50 Democratic senators, except this time the president and vice president, George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, were also Republicans, so Republicans had a majority for the same reason. Dick Cheney was also the president of the Senate. This lasted until June of 2001, when Vermont Senator Jim Jeffords switched his registration from a Republican to an independent, and therefore gave control of the Senate back to Democrats. Democrats were concerned about doing bold legislation primarily because doing so could very well cause such a thing to happen again. One senior progressive congressional staffer said that when groups don't disappear entirely to deal with internal strife, the discord is still noticeable on the other end. I've noticed a real erosion of the number of groups who are effective at leveraging progressive power in Congress. Some of that is these groups have these organizational culture things that are affecting them, the staffer said, because of the organizational culture of some of the real movement groups that have lots of chapters. What they're lobbying on isn't relevant to the actual fight in Congress. Some of these groups are in Overton mode when we have a trifecta. The idea, in theory, is that pushing their public policy demands further and further left widens the so-called Overton window of what's considered possible, thereby facilitating the future passage of ambitious legislation. Those maximalist political demands can also be a byproduct of internal strife, as organization leaders fend off charges of not internally embodying progressive values by pushing external rhetoric further left. But, the aide pointed out, there is legislative potential now. There are wins to be had between now and the next couple months that could change the country forever, and folks are focused on the stuff that has no theory for change for even getting to the House floor for a vote. Sunrise is doing their Green New Deal pledge, the aide continued, describing the Sunrise Movement-led effort to get elected officials and candidates to sign on to an ambitious climate commitment. The climate bill is still on the table. There's a universe where people are on the outside, focused on power and leveraging power for progressives in Congress. Instead, they're spending resources on stuff that is totally unrelated to governing. Nobody says, hey guys, could you maybe come and maybe focus on this? But the Green New Deal's proposals were incredibly popular among voters around this time. It's not exactly the fault of the activist groups if politicians do not respond to such a political incentive organically. However, it still wasn't happening for a variety of different reasons that can't be fixed by basic organizing and protesting. For example, one of the reasons why West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin was so against voting for specific proposals regarding climate change was because his state is the second largest producer of coal in the U.S. What exactly are progressives supposed to do there? Change West Virginia's economy from the ground up? How would you achieve such a thing? What exactly are you suggesting here? And none of this is me saying I'm against these proposals, by the way. It is me saying that if you want to blame progressive organizers and protesters for not being effective enough in delivering their messaging, and essentially say that's the reason we don't have a more progressive country, I'm going to take some issue with that if it sounds like you don't know what you're talking about. Too much hype about what was possible electorally also played a role, said another leader. Unrealistic expectations about what could be achieved through the electoral and legislative process has led us to give up on persuasion and believe convenient myths that we can change everything by mobilizing a mythological base, he said. This has led to navel-gazing and constant rehashing of internal culture debates because the progressive movement is no longer convinced it can have an impact on the external world. So that's two completely contradictory thoughts put together. If progressives are already under the impression they have the majority of the American public on their side, isn't that more reason to galvanize those who support them, if only because they're so close to victory already that all they need to do is take the already existing support and turn it into an electoral majority that will vote in politicians who actually agree with these policies? Also, progressives have consistently talked about how they're the ones with the majority on their side. It was the basis for one of the chapters in Michael Moore's book, Dude, Where's My Country, that came out in 2003, for example. So you framing this as some sort of new aspect of the progressive movement is just utterly nonsensical. Then the Sierra Club structure, which has relied on thousands of volunteers, many empowered with significant responsibility, also came under scrutiny after a volunteer was accused of rape. The consulting firm Ramona Strategies was brought in for an extensive restorative accountability process that The Intercept described last summer as an internal reckoning around race, gender, and sexual as well as other abuse allegations. Being a volunteer-led organization cannot stand for volunteers having carte blanche to ignore legal requirements or organizational values around equity and inclusivity, or basic human decency, the consultant's report stated. All employees should be managed by and subject to the oversight of individuals also under the organization's clear control and direction as employees. There is no other way we can see. The recommendation was the logical dead-end point of the inward focus, having only employees and no volunteers, or in the case of Everytown for Gun Safety, asking volunteers to sign non-disclosure agreements, would render moot the structure of most major movement groups, such as Indivisible, Sunrise, Move On, the NAACP, and so on. Okay, that notion is disputed in the very article Grimm is discussing, which also notes the following about the report given to the Sierra Club. The report's authors noted that they are unaware of any other organization that has delegated management authority to volunteers in the way the Sierra Club has. They advise that the structure be revised. Essentially, other organizations not running like the Sierra Club did would have no impact on their success because no other organization was ran like the Sierra Club in the first place. Inner turmoil can often begin, the managers said, with performance-based disputes that spiral into moral questions. I also see a pattern of people who are not competent in their orgs getting ahead of the game by declaring that others have engaged in some kind of ism, thereby triggering a process that protects them in that job while there's an investigation or turmoil over it, the foundation official added. Such disputes then trigger broader cultural conversations, with battle lines being drawn on each side. The same is true on campaigns. Diane Morales, a woman of color, saw her New York mayoral campaign blown up by a staff uprising, which included complaints of mistreatment, misogyny, and racism, as well as a demand that workers be paid while on strike, which Morales noted was illegal given the campaign's use of public financing. In other cases, staff have approached local chapters of the Democratic Socialists of America to level complaints against candidates they worked or had worked for, including Hassan Lekki, a Muslim immigrant from Morocco running for a congressional seat outside Boston, Brandy Brooks, a black woman running for Montgomery County Council in Maryland, and Shahad Battar, an Adamadi Muslim immigrant running for Congress in San Francisco. When the chapters moved to unendorse, citing toxicity inside the workplace, the campaigns are crippled. The last person listed was directly accused of sexual harassment by a woman he had known for 20 years. As was Brooks, which Ryan should know, given he wrote the article linked regarding this topic. Look, obviously a cost-benefit analysis needs to be had before a campaign is disavowed. I'm not sitting here and denying that. And obviously throwing anyone to the wayside the second anything even mildly problematic surfaces about them is not a good idea. However, a line has to be drawn somewhere. It just does. If only to make sure that a movement could properly exist that lives up to the ideas it espouses. Also, do you have any evidence any of these candidates were going to win anyway before these accusations surfaced? Because you completely skipped over the part where these were people with genuine chances at electoral success. I just want it to be known, by the way, that although I am picking apart some of the more substantive aspects of the article, the vast majority of it is just anonymously sourced quotes which don't really prove anything. However, I have essentially gone over the major themes already, including that it places way more emphasis on the failure of activist groups than on the failure of politicians, And it frequently describes situations where, honestly, it does sound at least somewhat reasonable for there to be internal conflict over those people being involved.
But it misses a key factor. In order to fend off the rise of economic populism in the form of Bernie Sanders in 2016, it was those same party leaders themselves who turned to identity politics, portraying themselves as the true champions of progressive values and deriding Sanders as a single-issue candidate, that issue being the economy. Here's Hillary Clinton going after Bernie Sanders.
Not everything is about an economic theory, right? If we broke up the big banks tomorrow, and I will, if they deserve it, if they pose any systemic risk, I will. Would that end racism? No. Would that end sexism? No. Would that end discrimination against the LGBT community?
Okay, notice how Clinton said she was open to the idea of breaking up the big banks. A detail completely left out of the article version of this rant, by the way, which instead frames Clinton mentioning this as some sort of attempt to dodge the issue of breaking up the big banks. Because Clinton's point was not that such a thing is inherently a bad idea, but more that Sanders had failed to merge his proposed economic policies with an effective progressive social agenda. By the way, that's not me saying that Sanders wasn't a progressive on social issues by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, this is a man who protested segregation in the 1960s and supported LGBT rights all the way back in the 1980s. It would be ridiculous to so much as imply anything of the sort. However, if you don't translate that into effective social policy in the modern day, then what exactly is the point in voting for you? We don't elect a president who serves the previous 4 years, after all. I'm not even saying I agree with Clinton's attack here, for the record. I'm just saying it was dishonestly framed by Grimm.
Now, suffice to say, we did not break up the big banks, and we did not end racism.
Well, yeah, a Republican ended up winning that presidential election. What exactly were you expecting?
It's apparently easy to forget that the working class drift away from Democrats that was underway in the 1980s and 1990s was reversed in 2008 by Barack Obama, who ran as an anti-war candidate against a party shredded by its spearheading of the disastrous invasion of Iraq. 8 years later, Trump bested Bush's brother and every other Republican contender this way.
I'm skipping past the Trump clips partly because of how much time they take up, but also because a large chunk of the first clip played, that being the one from a 2016 primary debate, didn't actually need to be in the video. As for your point that Trump got so successful partly because he criticized foreign interventionism, Donald Trump was not the only Republican to do that in the 2016 campaign. Rand Paul also ran for president in 2016, for those who don't know, on a rather anti-interventionist platform. Not unlike the non-interventionist views his father famously held during his runs for president as a Republican in 2008 and 2012, which weren't even successful enough to get him the nomination. Hell, Obama wasn't even the only person running in 2008 explicitly on a platform of anti-interventionism and anti-Iraq war sentiment. Both Mike Gravel and Dennis Kucinich both also tried to get the Democratic nomination on strictly anti-war platforms. As in, they were strictly anti-war, not as in that was the only issue they discussed. With Gravel even playing more anti-war than thou with Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and Joe Biden during one of the debates.
And I gotta tell you, after standing up with them, some of these people frighten me. They frighten me. When you have mainline candidates that turn around and say that there's nothing off the table with respect to Iran, that's code for using nukes, nuclear devices. I got to tell you, I'm President of the United States. There will be no preemptive wars with nuclear devices. To my mind, it's immoral, and it's been immoral for the last 50 years as part of American foreign policy.
Let's use a little moderator discretion here. Senator Gravel, that's a weighty charge. Who on this stage exactly tonight worries you so much?
Well, I would say the top-tier ones. The top tier ones. They've made statements. Oh, Joe, I'll include you too. You have a certain arrogance. You want to tell the Iraqis how to run their country. I got to tell you, we should just play get out. Just plain get out. It's their country. They're asking us to leave, and we insist on staying there. And why not get out? What harm is it going to do? Oh, you hear the statement, well, my God, the soldiers will have died in vain. The entire deaths of Vietnam died in vain. And they're dying in vain right this very second. And you know what's worse than a soldier dying in vain? Is more soldiers dying in vain. That's what's worse.
Also, if the working class is so inherently opposed to foreign interventionism, why did you begin the mention of them becoming Republicans with the 1980s? You know, the Reagan years? A man who was famous for his militaristic rhetoric during the Cold War, which he also translated into genuine policy throughout the course of his first term, albeit he did put a greater focus on diplomacy with the Soviet Union during his second.
Now, when liberals see America first, they read it as xenophobic and anti-immigrant, but Trump's supporters scan it as a promise not to waste money on wars and nation building while our own country crumbles.
I'm sure some do. However, there's also people within the Republican base who oppose immigration or are xenophobic. Because there are people in essentially any base that oppose immigration and are xenophobic. You're making an equally as blanket statement here as you criticize Democrats for. You do understand that, right?
Sharing the campaign stage down the stretch with Liz Cheney was a signal to voters that Democrats felt the cost of those wars was worth it, and that we'd get more of the same in a Harris administration.
Then those voters weren't paying attention to the Harris campaign. Tim Walz, who was Harris's choice for running mate back in the 2024 election, directly said when asked by Jon Stewart on The Daily Show that the campaigning with Liz Cheney was done to show that Republicans could vote for Harris. It wasn't an endorsement of their foreign policy.
Yeah, there is still a core group of folks out there, you know, your point being, and not joke, the don't tread on me, the Reagan piece of this, the libertarian piece, but the constitutional piece.
Yes.
There are a lot of people out there. I think Liz Cheney and Dick Cheney give permission to those folks who want to find a reason to do the right thing. It doesn't mean they agree with us. We're not going to take their foreign policy decisions and discussions, you know, and implement those. We're going to take their
promise?
Yes, promise.
Yeah.
But with all that in mind, let's actually get into the article I planned on covering in the first place. From 2020 to 2024, Democrats saw a staggering drop-off in support at the presidential level, with some 19 million people who voted for Joe Biden staying home or not mailing in their ballots in 2024. Now, a new survey conducted by YouGov suggests Biden's support for Israel's unrelenting assault on Gaza played a surprisingly large role in the choice of those previous Biden supporters not to vote. Read the full poll here. Okay, first off, I could find absolutely nothing to back up the 19 million number that Ryan is using, and he provides no citation to back up his claim. Also, the poll he cites just doesn't say what he says it did. In fact, it didn't even study the topic he said it did. It was specifically about Biden voters who voted for somebody else in 2024, not Biden voters who didn't vote in 2024. By the way, neither IMEU nor Ryan Grim actually make any attempt to quantify how many people fell into the categories being discussed here. Meaning this data is, if I may be scientific, fucking worthless from a practical standpoint. You can say 100% of X did Y, however, until you tell me how big of a population X was, you're not actually giving me anything worthwhile in terms of information. The top reason those non-voters cited, above the economy at 24% and immigration at 11%, was Gaza. A full 29% cited the ongoing onslaught as the top reason they didn't cast a vote in 2024. Again, that's just not what the study said, and I mean that in the most literal sense possible. Ryan Grim is getting a very basic detail about the topic he is discussing completely wrong. The study was not of the demographic he thinks it is. And I know I'm harping on this, but I just need to stress how terrible this article is as a piece of journalism. This isn't Ryan Grim screwing up, say, a fact in one of the middle paragraphs that he was remembering off the top of his head. Nor is this a case of him, say, citing an article, but he only reads some of it for whatever reason, and it turns out the later parts completely contradict what he's saying. I wouldn't recommend such things, obviously. However, those are at the very least understandable reasons for making mistakes and accidentally giving factually incorrect information in an article. This is him basing the entirety of an argument off of an article that the headline shows he didn't actually understand. And what's especially baffling about this, and the reason I believe this was a genuine error on Ryan Grim's part and not him trying to be dishonest, is the actual study makes a better case. Given the major difference between non-voters and people who vote for other candidates is that those who vote for other candidates cancel out the votes of people who vote for a specific candidate, while non-voters just don't add to any tally whatsoever. But Ryan Grim instead telephoned the study into something that actually makes his case weaker and not stronger. This is so fucking bizarre. Breaking with Biden on Gaza could have had knock-on effects elsewhere, as Harris never successfully answered a question that dogged her throughout her campaign. What would she have done differently than Biden? Or what would she do differently in the future? Eventually, Harris settled on the unsatisfying answer, my presidency will not be a continuation of Joe Biden's presidency, and like every new president that comes into the office, I will bring my life experiences, my professional experiences, and fresh and new ideas, she said in one emblematic response. Clearly, I am not Joe Biden, she said at the presidential debate, yet she had no answer for how they diverged, other than, and I am certainly not Donald Trump. In an appearance on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, she reiterated these points, and followed with a gobbledygook response about American aspirations and opportunity and small businesses. In other high-profile interviews, she similarly declined to offer any answer as to what she would do differently other than be a different person. This is something you hear a lot in the pundisphere, but it doesn't actually make any sense upon examination. We don't live in a time before the 12th Amendment where the vice president was just the person who got second place in the presidential election. The vice president is somebody who is specifically advertised as the second in command to the president and serves as a person being voted for alongside the president. Eventually, the question is going to arise of, why the fuck was she vice president during the Biden administration? If she apparently had all these disagreements with Joe Biden, the person who she was second in command for. And this was a question being asked even regarding the occasional breaks with the Biden administration she did while campaigning. I distinctly remember a Freedom Tunes cartoon which got some popularity among conservatives during the election, which essentially saw somebody asking the question of why Harris hadn't done all these amazing things as if she had been president that she promised to do on the campaign trail. A question not asked of the guy who was president before, by the way.
Let me tell you guys about... I have a plan. An incredible plan to lower inflation. If you elect me, inflation is gone.
Wow.
That's incredible.
It's true, I am.
Why can't you just do it now?
Next topic!
Anyway, when I'm reminded of Freedom Tunes, that's usually a good sign the commentary has gone on for too long. So, to give my final thoughts, here is Ryan Grimm's sibling, David Grimm.
Mom's disowning you. Bitch. Good night, and good luck.